Hey everyone, so my name is Gordon. You've already been introduced to me. So I'm here to talk about Queerness Divided and the ways that discrimination shows up within the queer community and how different intersections of identity manifest themselves within our community. And before I get started, I want to let everybody know I'm going to be speaking from the perspective of a white gay man, so one of the people who has pretty much the most power within the queer community, and talking about the ways that that manifests itself in comparison to other identities. So, another thing before we really jump into this, there's a lot of different types of discrimination. In 7 minutes, I'm not going to be able to cover every single one, and I'm not even going to be able to cover the ones that I do hit very well. It's going to be kind of like a highlight reel, all right? So before we get started, let's talk about what intersectionality is. Intersectionality is an idea that posits that identities are layered and multifaceted, and it positions people at the intersections of these facets. And it talks about discrimination as not just an additive force, but a multiplicative force. So this means that somebody who is black and queer is going to experience the racism and homophobia, but also a combination of the two as a black queer person. Now, one of the first types of discrimination I want to talk about is transphobia. This is a really important one for the queer community because the queer community is also known as the LGBT community, and T stands for trans. So this is somebody is a community that is part of the name of the queer community, and we still don't always show up for them in the ways that we should. We see this in the fact that trans people lack quality access to healthcare. They are more than 4 times likely than a cis person to be in a state of poverty. And in addition to that, when important non-discrimination legislation comes around, like the 2007 federal ENDA bill, we often forego the rights of trans folks for the rights of simply sexually diverse people. One of the heroes of the trans community that's fighting for equality within the queer community is Marsha P. Johnson. This is a woman who is credited with the throwing of the first brick at the Stonewall riots. She is the person who really launched the queer movement that we know and love today, and she is somebody who has fought for transphobia or fought against transphobia and fought for queer rights in everything she's done until she was murdered at 46. Another discrimination that we have in the queer community is racism. And No Justice, No Pride is an organization that protested at the DC Pride Parade because of the inclusion of the DC Sheriff's Department and Police Department as a sponsor. And they didn't really like that because of the ways that people of color have experienced discrimination against the police department. We see this also in that white queer folks are not always very accepting of racially diverse identities, in that when the black and brown stripes were added to the flag in Philadelphia, white queer folks were completely up in arms against it. They didn't like what was happening to their pretty flag. One of the heroes of this community is Preston Mitchum. He is a black queer feminist who writes about the ways that being black and queer manifests for himself and for other individuals and for other queer people of color, and what we can do as a queer community in order to fix those issues and center those voices in our discussions. Next issue that I want to talk about is sexism. This is a really important issue because a lot of queer men and a lot of gay men are pretty misogynistic. They will often perpetuate standards of sexual harassment, namely grabbing women's breasts and or other, like their rear ends or something, and they'll pass it off as saying, I'm queer, so it doesn't matter, when in fact that is still just as despicable as if a straight man were to do it. In addition, we see that androgyny in the queer community often shows up as very masculine. You'll rarely see a skirt on an androgynous individual. One of the heroes for the sexism movement in the queer community is Julia Serrano. She is a trans woman who writes books, plays, music, poems about the ways that being woman and female body person in the queer community manifests itself and what we can do to center those voices. The next thing that I would like to talk about is ableism. Ableism is another important issue within the queer community because even though we are meant to be a community that is particularly inclusive and very accepting of everybody, we oftentimes don't even lay out a ramp for folks who use wheelchairs and don't allow accessibility to our spaces to those who might need a little bit extra help. In addition to this, although there is a higher rate of mental illness within the queer community and a higher rate of neurodivergence, we oftentimes don't or are not accepting of the triggers that those folks may have, or the aid that they might need in order to be able to experience our spaces to the fullest of their abilities. One of the heroes for this is, his name is Nick Moreno. He identifies as a Chicano, disabled, queer, non-binary guy who uses he, him pronouns, and he writes about the ways that being disabled and being queer intersect for him, and the ways that capitalism and hegemony really bring down the disabled community and the queer community especially. Another myth that we have within the queer community deals with socioeconomic status discrimination, and this myth is gay affluence, and this is the idea that gay folks are in cities, they have a lot of money, they have a lot of political power because of that money, and this really makes it difficult for individuals who may need some financial help or some socioeconomic help as a queer person to get that help. One of the heroes of this community is Sylvia Rivera. She was a friend of Marsha P. Johnson. She was also one of the people who started the Stonewall riots and launched the queer community movement. However, throughout her activism, she always centered low-income queer folks and tried to get them the same voice that high-income queer folks had in our community. Another and one of the last communities that I'd like to talk about is the HIV/AIDS community. It's an interesting community because we, as queer individuals, we were sort of an epicenter, especially gay men, for the AIDS epidemic in the early 80s and stuff. And yet today, you might go around to queer spaces and find individuals who are still just as afraid and unknowledgeable of HIV and AIDS as other non-queer individuals. One of the heroes of this community is Peter Staley. He is somebody who has been fighting for over 30 years to improve the awareness and decrease the stigma surrounding HIV/AIDS individuals within and without of the queer community. And finally, the last type of discrimination I'd like to talk about is ageism. Ageism is another important type of discrimination within the queer community. You'll notice I've said important for every single one of these communities so far, and it's because they are all very important for the individuals that are experiencing them. But the way ageism manifests itself is that it's a juxtaposition of the hypersexuality of the queer community and the decreasing sexuality of somebody as they age, and really how do you manifest your identity within both of those categories. So you may be wondering, now that I've gone through all of those types of discriminations, hit the highlights, what can I do to make the queer community more inclusive? Or if you're not somebody who's part of the queer community, what can I do to make the spaces that I do inhabit more inclusive? Really what you need to do, it's cliche saying, but you need to check your privilege. You need to understand where your identities give you power and where you lie on the spectrum, and how you can help center voices who may not have the same power that you have in your discussions about where the queer community or your communities are going and how they can become more inclusive. Thank you.